In the spring of 1940, German soldiers crossed into Western Europe and did something that military commanders on the other side simply could not explain. They moved without stopping, they fought without sleeping, they advanced through terrain and at a pace that, by every established understanding of human physiology, should have been impossible. Allied officers looking at the maps could not account for it. Neither could their men, who were overwhelmed before they had time to form a coherent defense. What those soldiers were experiencing on the other end of that assault was not simply superior tactics or better equipment, it was something that had been put into their bodies. And what it made them capable of doing was far darker than most history books have been willing to describe in full. In 1938, a German pharmaceutical company called Temmler began mass-producing a stimulant drug under the brand name Pervitin. The active compound was methamphetamine. In the years before the war, it was sold openly in German pharmacies, marketed in chocolate form, recommended to housewives for energy and weight management, handed to students before exams. It was treated, in the late 1930s, not as a dangerous substance but as a modern wonder of chemistry. The German military took notice quickly. By 1939, military pharmacologist Otto Ranke had begun conducting trials on university students to measure Pervitin's effect on performance under fatigue. The results were striking enough that Ranke submitted a formal recommendation to the Wehrmacht High Command. This drug could solve one of the most persistent problems in modern warfare, the physical limits of the human soldier. What followed was one of the largest pharmacological experiments in the history of organized military conflict. In the lead-up to the invasion of France and the Low Countries in May 1940, the German military distributed somewhere between 35 million and 40 million Pervitin tablets to Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS troops. Soldiers were told to take them when needed to stay alert during extended operations. Officers encouraged their use. In some units, distribution was mandatory. The drug's effects on the human body in those doses and at that frequency were severe, even if they were not immediately visible to the men taking them. Methamphetamine forces the brain to flood itself with dopamine and norepinephrine, the chemicals associated with alertness, confidence, and physical drive. The user feels capable of sustained effort that would otherwise be impossible. Pain recedes, fear becomes manageable, sleep seems unnecessary. For a soldier asked to march for 3 days with minimal rest and fight at the end of it, those effects were exactly what military planners were looking for. But the drug did not only affect alertness, it affected judgment. It affected the threshold for violence. It affected the way soldiers perceived the people they encountered, prisoners, wounded men, civilians, during and after combat. And it was in those encounters that the effects of mass methamphetamine use began to produce something that went beyond military advantage into a category of behavior that soldiers on the Allied side would struggle for the rest of their lives to describe. The German invasion of France and the Low Countries, which began on May 10, 1940, lasted 46 days before France requested an armistice. In military terms, it was one of the most astonishing campaigns in modern history. A complete collapse of an adversary that, on paper, had comparable numbers of troops and equipment. Military historians have spent decades analyzing the tactical and strategic factors that made it possible. The Ardennes breakthrough, the failure of French command structures, the speed of the armored advance. All of those factors were real, but the human element, the physical capacity of German soldiers to sustain that advance for days without meaningful rest, was made possible in large part by Pervitin. The personal accounts left behind by German soldiers from that campaign paint a consistent picture. Letters sent home from the front during May and June of 1940 describe a state of almost mechanical persistence. Men who kept moving when their bodies told them to stop, who felt detached from ordinary sensation, who found that the normal psychological breaks that prevent soldiers from committing acts of extreme violence were not functioning in the usual way. One German soldier's letter from that period, later examined by historian Norman Ohler, described the experience of continuous movement as something close to a dreamlike state, no clear sense of time passing, no meaningful fatigue, a feeling of being propelled forward by something outside of ordinary will. Pervitin was not the only factor in what happened during the French campaign, but it was present in nearly every unit that carried out the advance, and its effects showed in the treatment of prisoners and civilians encountered during the rapid German push westward. In multiple locations across Belgium and France, German soldiers who had been awake and combat active for 48 to 72 hours or more were involved in killings of prisoners and non-combatants that were later documented by Allied investigators. The massacre at Vinkt, Belgium, took place between May 27th and 28th, 1940. German soldiers from the 225th Infantry Division, having taken the town, rounded up male civilians and held them in a field. Over those 2 days, approximately 86 civilians, men and older boys, were executed. The German military later attributed the killings to suspicions of civilian resistance activity. Post-war investigation found no credible basis for those claims. What the investigators did establish was that the soldiers involved had been in continuous operation for days, that the unit had taken casualties in the area, and that the killings had been carried out with a methodical efficiency that suggested neither panic nor uncontrolled mob behavior, but something colder, a state in which normal restraints had been suspended. The massacre at Vinkt was not an isolated incident during the 1940 campaign. Similar episodes occurred at Wormhout in France on May 28, 1940, where soldiers of the SS division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler killed approximately 90 British and French prisoners of war who had been taken during fighting around Dunkirk. The prisoners were forced into a barn and killed. The unit involved had been in active combat for days. Its soldiers were among the heaviest users of Pervitin in the German order of battle. None of this is to suggest that methamphetamine caused these massacres in a simple, mechanistic sense. The ideological framework of the SS, the dehumanization of enemies built into Nazi military culture, and specific orders and command failures all played roles. But the drug's documented effect on impulse control, on the perception of risk and consequence, and on the capacity for sustained violent action without psychological interruption is part of the picture. And it is a part that was largely absent from post-war analysis for decades. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, in an operation called Barbarossa, the scale and nature of the conflict changed entirely. This was not a campaign aimed at military defeat, followed by negotiated terms. It was a war of annihilation, fought under explicit ideological instructions that stripped the enemy of the protections that even the imperfect conventions of military conduct had previously provided. Soviet prisoners of war were not to be treated as regular prisoners under German military doctrine on the Eastern Front. They were classified, at the policy level, as racially and politically inferior, a designation that was used to justify their systematic starvation, forced labor under lethal conditions, and mass execution. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers taken prisoner by Germany during the war, an estimated 3.3 million died in captivity. That figure, representing roughly 58% of all Soviet prisoners, has no parallel in the treatment of Western Allied prisoners by Germany, and the difference was a matter of explicit policy, not logistics. In that environment, Pervitin continued to flow through German units on the Eastern Front, and its effects intersected with ideological directives to produce behavior that exceeded even what had been seen in Western Europe. German soldiers fighting in the Soviet Union were operating under conditions of extreme physical stress. The vast distances, the brutal winters beginning in late 1941, the ferocity of Soviet resistance, and Pervitin was used consistently to keep men combat-ready through conditions that would otherwise have stopped them. The drug's role in the execution of the Commissar Order is particularly significant. Issued before the invasion began, the Commissar Order instructed German troops to identify and kill Soviet political commissars, Communist Party officers embedded in Red Army units, upon capture rather than treating them as prisoners of war. The order was a direct violation of international laws of war, and it was carried out with a thoroughness that required individual soldiers to make personal decisions to kill unarmed men in custody. Medical and psychological research on methamphetamine consistently identifies reduced inhibition against harmful action as one of the drug's primary behavioral effects. For soldiers already operating under an ideological order to kill prisoners, that pharmacological reduction of hesitation had consequences that were measured in thousands of individual deaths. One of the most thoroughly documented examples of what German soldiers were capable of during the Eastern Front campaign, in units known to have been actively using Pervitin, is the massacre at Babi Yar, outside Kyiv, in late September 1941. Over 2 days, September 29th and 30th, members of Einsatzgruppe C and soldiers of the German 6th Army killed approximately 33,771 people, primarily Jewish civilians from Kyiv and the surrounding area. The operation was planned and organized, carried out in a ravine outside the city, and executed with a logistical efficiency that required sustained human effort over 2 full days. The soldiers involved had been in continuous active operations since the invasion began 3 months earlier. Babi Yar was one of the largest single mass killing events of the entire war. The men who carried it out did not act in a state of battle frenzy. The killing was organized, systematic, and prolonged, and it was carried out by soldiers whose capacity to sustain that kind of work, hour after hour, day after day, was being chemically supported. The German military's enthusiasm for Pervitin in the early war years was genuine, but it was not uninformed. By 1941, military doctors were already accumulating evidence of the drug's darker effects, and the picture that emerged from field reports and medical examinations was deeply troubling. Methamphetamine, taken repeatedly over days without sleep, does not simply keep a person awake. It pushes the human nervous system into a state of sustained emergency. The brain, forced to keep releasing stimulant chemicals, begins to deplete its own reserves. After the drug's effects wear off, and when soldiers were in the field, they often took additional doses before the previous ones had fully cleared. The crash was severe. Men who had been combat effective for 72 hours could become non-functional within hours of the drug leaving their system. Reports from German field officers describe soldiers who had completed extraordinary feats of endurance falling into states of near total incapacity, unable to respond to orders, disoriented, in some cases experiencing hallucinations. The cardiac effects were significant. Methamphetamine places enormous strain on the heart and vascular system. Military doctors documented cases of otherwise healthy young soldiers dying of cardiac events during or immediately after extended operations in which Pervitin had been used. The drug also produced severe hypertension, dangerously elevated blood pressure, that left soldiers at risk of stroke and other vascular events. The psychiatric effects were harder to measure, but ultimately more consequential. Extended methamphetamine use produces a condition that physicians at the time were beginning to document, and that is now well understood: a state of stimulant-induced psychosis characterized by paranoia, aggression, and an inability to accurately assess threat. For a soldier already trained to see the enemy as subhuman, already operating in an environment of sanctioned mass violence, and already exhausted to a degree that impaired normal judgment, adding chemically induced paranoia to that combination produced predictable outcomes. German military doctors, most notably Dr. Leonardo Conti, and later the medical staff of the Wehrmacht's own health inspectorate, began raising concerns about Pervitin by 1940 and 1941. Conti attempted to restrict its distribution, alarmed by the rates of dependency and cardiac complications being reported. His efforts had limited effect. The drug continued to flow through German military supply channels throughout the war, though in the later years it was increasingly rationed rather than distributed freely. By the middle years of the war, the German military had also begun encountering a problem it had not fully anticipated. Large numbers of soldiers who had used Pervitin heavily during major operations and were now physically and psychologically dependent on it. Withdrawal from methamphetamine produces extreme fatigue, depression, and cognitive impairment, none of which were conditions a military at war could accommodate easily. Some soldiers sought additional supplies through informal channels. Medical records from German field hospitals show a consistent pattern of soldiers presenting with symptoms that were consistent with stimulant dependency: erratic behavior, inability to sleep even when given the opportunity, severe mood disruption. The Nazi state, ideologically committed to the idea of the racially pure, physically superior German soldier, was deeply reluctant to acknowledge that it had created a dependency problem inside its own military. Records related to Pervitin use were handled with considerable discretion, and the full picture of its distribution and effects did not become available to historians until decades after the war, when German military medical archives were more systematically examined. For British soldiers retreating toward Dunkirk in May 1940, the experience of facing German troops who simply did not stop was profoundly disorienting. Veterans of that campaign described, in post-war interviews and memoirs, a quality of relentlessness in the German advance that went beyond what they had expected from the tactical situation. Units that should have needed rest kept coming. Attacks that should have paused through the night continued. The normal rhythms of military operation, advance, consolidate, rest, advance, seemed not to apply. British soldiers taken prisoner during the Dunkirk campaign and its immediate aftermath found themselves in the custody of men who were, in some cases, in severely altered psychological states. The killings at Wormhout on May 28, 1940, carried out by soldiers of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, left survivors who later gave testimony about the behavior of their captors. Those accounts described soldiers who were agitated, seemed to require no rest, communicated in ways that suggested disrupted cognition, and carried out the killings with what survivors described as a mechanical detachment rather than rage. That description aligns closely with the known behavioral profile of methamphetamine intoxication at the stage where the drug begins producing dissociative effects. American soldiers entering the war in North Africa in 1942 and 1943 encountered German forces whose combat stamina continued to draw comment from officers and enlisted men alike. The Afrika Korps, under Erwin Rommel, had developed a reputation for operational pace that stressed Allied supply and command structures consistently. Pervitin was documented in use across Rommel's command throughout the North African campaign, and Rommel himself was known to have used the drug personally during the French campaign of the 1940. American after-action reports from the Tunisian campaign in early 1943 noted repeatedly that German units demonstrated an ability to mount sustained operations across extended periods that American commanders found difficult to explain through training or doctrine alone. The gap in performance that those reports struggled to account for had, at least in part, a pharmaceutical explanation that no one on the Allied side had yet fully identified. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the German military's use of Pervitin was more rationed than it had been in 1940, partly due to supply constraints and partly due to the growing acknowledgement within military medical command that unrestricted use was creating problems. But it remained in circulation, and the units defending the Normandy coast and the subsequent campaign in France and into Germany continued to have access to it. American and British soldiers fighting through Normandy and into the Falaise Pocket in August 1944 encountered episodes of resistance from German units that veterans consistently described as out of proportion to the tactical situation. Units that held positions long past the point where withdrawal would have been the rational choice, that counterattacked in circumstances where counterattack made no military sense, and that inflicted casualties in situations where the fighting should have been over. Post-war analysis of some of those engagements, cross-referenced with German supply records, has found consistent correlation between heavy Pervitin availability in specific units and extreme resistance behaviors in those same units' operational records. For the Allied soldiers involved, men who were fighting sober, on normal sleep cycles, with the psychological equipment of ordinary human beings, the experience of facing an adversary whose relationship to pain, fear, and fatigue had been chemically altered was one that many found nearly impossible to fully communicate afterward. The men they were fighting were not following the rules of human limitation that both sides should have been subject to equally. And when they encountered German prisoners, men in the crash phase after extended Pervitin use, haggard, disoriented, sometimes visibly unwell, they were looking at the other side of that same pharmacological equation. As Germany's strategic position deteriorated through 1944 and into 1945, the role of chemical stimulants within the military evolved in a direction that reflected the broader collapse of rational military thinking inside the Nazi state. In the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, submarine crews had been using Pervitin since early in the war to sustain the extraordinarily demanding watch schedules that underwater warfare required. Submarine service involved patrols lasting weeks or months, in confined spaces, under constant threat, with sleep schedules that bore no relationship to normal human circadian rhythms. Pervitin made it possible for crews to function in those conditions, but the cost, in dependency, in psychological deterioration, and in the quality of decision-making during critical moments, was significant. Former U-boat crew members who survived the war described what they called a kind of sustained numbness that took hold during long patrols involving heavy drug use, a state in which events that should have registered as alarming or distressing simply did not register that way anymore. Among Luftwaffe pilots, Pervitin was also widespread, but by 1944, German military pharmacologists had developed a new compound, specifically for aviators facing extended missions, a tablet known internally as das Housewives, which combined methamphetamine with cocaine and a pain-killing agent. The drug was designed to allow pilots and crew to sustain combat effectiveness over mission profiles that would otherwise be physically impossible. Testing on concentration camp prisoners at Sachsenhausen, a historical fact documented in post-war testimony and confirmed in German records, showed that men given D9 could march with heavy loads for extraordinary distances before collapsing. The testing itself was lethal. Those who participated and survived did not do so in any condition resembling health. D9 was under development for use in suicide boat and submarine operations, missions in which the operator was not expected to return. The logic of pairing a drug that removed the fear response with a mission designed to end in the operator's death was not coincidental. German military planners in the final phase of the war were actively looking for chemical means to overcome the basic human instinct towards self-preservation in order to field weapons that no rational, undrugged person would agree to operate. The Volkssturm, the hastily assembled civilian militia that Germany put into the field in the final months of the war, consisting of old men and boys as young as 16, was also supplied with Pervitin. These were not trained soldiers. They were civilians with minimal preparation being sent into combat against professional Allied armies that were advancing into Germany from both east and west. Pervitin was given to them not because it would make them effective fighters, but because it would make them willing to fight at all. The drug's capacity to suppress the fear response and generate a temporary sense of capability was, in this final application, being used to send people who had no realistic chance of survival into situations where they would be killed, and to do so in a way that bypassed whatever judgment might otherwise have told them to refuse. Among those teenagers and older men captured by Allied forces in the final months of the war, American and British soldiers described encountering prisoners in states of severe physical and psychological distress, individuals who had clearly been sustaining themselves on stimulants and were now in various stages of the drug's aftermath. Some were combative despite being physically overwhelmed. Some were barely responsive. Some showed signs of the kind of stimulant-induced psychosis that prolonged methamphetamine use produces, disconnected from the reality of their situation in ways that made them simultaneously dangerous and pitiable. When the war ended in May 1945 and Allied forces began the systematic examination of German military records, the documentation of Pervitin's role in German military operations was present in those records. But it was not treated as a priority subject in the early years of post-war historical analysis. There were practical reasons for this. The immediate focus of war crimes investigators was on the Holocaust, on the medical experiments conducted in concentration camps, and on the command structures that had directed the mass killings of the Eastern Front. The question of what soldiers had been given to make them more effective fighters seemed secondary, a logistics matter rather than a war crimes matter. There were also less straightforward reasons. In the late 1940s and 1950s, the Western Allied powers, particularly the United States, were actively recruiting German scientists, engineers, and military specialists for use in the emerging Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. Operation Paperclip brought German scientists, including some who had been involved in military pharmacological research, into American employment. The program was explicitly designed to extract German technical expertise before it could be acquired by the Soviet Union, and it operated with a degree of deliberate opacity about the wartime records of many of the men it recruited. A full public accounting of what methamphetamine had done inside the German military was not in the interest of programs that were quietly incorporating that same military's expertise into Western defense structures. The subject was not suppressed through a single coordinated decision. It simply was not a priority for the people who had every incentive to look elsewhere. The German government and society in the post-war period also had reasons to avoid the subject. The image of the German soldier as a methamphetamine user did not fit any of the narratives that post-war West Germany was constructing about the war. Neither the narrative of ideological victimhood, nor the narrative of the professional soldier doing his duty in a bad cause. The drug added a dimension of pharmacological complicity that was simply easier to leave unexamined. What changed was the slow work of historians over decades, particularly after German military and medical archives became more fully accessible in the 1990s and 2000s. The work of journalist and historian Norman Ohler, whose 2015 book on the subject drew on previously under-examined German military medical records, brought the subject to mainstream historical attention for the first time in a comprehensive way. Ohler documented not only the scale of Pervitin distribution, those 35 to 40 million tablets in 1940 alone, but also the paper trail connecting specific military operations to specific drug supply records, and the internal German medical debate about what was being created inside the Wehrmacht and the SS. What those records showed was a military that had, from the very beginning of its most aggressive campaigns, been operating in a state of mass pharmacological alteration, and that had used that alteration to sustain operations, suppress hesitation, and push soldiers past the physical and psychological limits that would otherwise have constrained them. The implications for understanding specific war crimes are significant, even if they are not exculpatory. Methamphetamine does not make a person commit atrocities. It does not override moral agency entirely, but it systematically reduces the psychological barriers that normally prevent people from acting on violent impulse. It produces paranoia that generates threat perception where none exists. It generates a sense of invulnerability and superiority, and it enables sustained engagement with acts of violence over periods of time that would otherwise be psychologically intolerable. When those pharmacological effects are combined with an ideological framework that has already dehumanized the enemy, with command structures that are actively ordering atrocities, and with a military culture that has insulated itself from any accountability, the result is what the historical record of the German military between 1939 and 1945 actually shows. The soldiers who carried out the killings at Winkt, at Wormhout, at Babi Yar, and across the Eastern Front were not simply following orders, and they were not simply monsters. They were human beings who had been systematically altered, ideologically, institutionally, and pharmacologically, into something that their own pre-war selves would not have recognized. Understanding that does not diminish the responsibility of the men who gave the orders, designed the systems, or manufactured the ideology. It adds a layer of specificity to how those systems produced the outcomes they did. The drug is not a footnote to the history of Nazi Germany's military. It is part of the mechanism, one of the most direct and concrete ways in which the Nazi state transformed ordinary men into instruments of extraordinary violence. And the fact that it took 70 years for that part of the story to receive serious historical attention is itself a fact worth sitting with. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.